We are currently in the middle of a series assessing the extent of Lyndon Johnson's involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy, if any. But we're going to take a short break from LBJ before coming back for the second part of the LBJ series in July. In light of the most recent hearing on the Congressional Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets that was on May 20th, which was again focused exclusively on the JFK assassination, we have a special bonus episode today with one of the witnesses, Doug Horne. If you've studied the JFK assassination for any period of time, you surely know Doug Horne. He served on the staff of the Assassination Records Review Board for the final 3 years of its 4-year lifespan, from August of 1995 through September of 1998. He was hired as a senior analyst on the military records team and was later promoted to head that team. In that role, Doug obtained and declassified military records related to Cuba and Vietnam policy and worked extensively in the medical evidence arena. He also served as the ARRB's point man on issues related to the Zapruder film. We have the tenacity of Doug Horne to thank for many of the key declassifications in this case. Doug is the author of the comprehensive 5-volume series on the ARRB called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. He's one of the foremost experts in the world on the JFK autopsy and medical evidence, and he's a vocal critic of the official story. Today, we'll hear what Doug Horne has learned from his many years of up-close and extensive study of the medical evidence in the assassination of President Kennedy.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I don't know what this is all about.
Dallas police this morning resumed custody. The man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? Commission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working I'm just a patsy.
This is Doug. Welcome to Solving JFK. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, Matt, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you and to your audience, so thank you.
It's going to be an exciting show. Lots that we can cover. I told Doug, I told you before the show, I've always wanted to talk to you, but I've held off on reaching out because I've never, been prepared enough to really have the conversation. But given the timing of you just speaking before Congress, now is as good of a time as any, and we very well may chat again. So let's go ahead and get into your recent testimony before Congress and just tell us a little bit about that, if you could, Doug.
Sure, that's a good place to start. It all came together very quickly for me. The second and final hearing on JFK records was held on May 20th on a Tuesday. So I was called on Friday by a third party who was trying to persuade the committee to have me testify the following Tuesday. Talk about the 11th hour. But Monday morning, it all came together, and I got the invitation letter signed by Congresswoman Luna on my birthday, May 19th. It was a nice birthday present. I got to say what I wanted for my 10 minutes, and I had a very engaging many minutes during the Q&A later with Chairwoman Luna. She asked me 4 questions in a row, and the last 2 were very important. And you can watch those later in the hearing. So when I got home, I realized there'd been a total media blackout by television in the United States. And of course, I was not happy. Sure. But I found out that not only did NBC, ABC, and CBS not carry the hearing live, listen to this, neither did C-SPAN. Now that's nauseating because I'm 99% sure C-SPAN carried the first hearing on April 1st of her task force. And C-SPAN has three channels. One of them is for the House, one is for the Senate, and one is for public hearings. So they had 2 channels that could have carried this hearing. And I don't care how many hearings were going on that day. There were other hearings, but they should have recorded it. And so when I went home, I talked to friends and they said, oh, it wasn't on TV. It wasn't on C-SPAN or anywhere else.
Hmm.
Then I found out it wasn't covered on the evening news by any major network. And that's when I really got disgusted. So I went on C-SPAN 3 times. This is the end of my story about media suppression, but I went online 3 times in the following week on the C-SPAN site. And I kept typing in Luna hearing, Luna subcommittee hearing, Luna task force, May 20th hearing. If they had recorded this, as they should have, you should be able to go online now and click on the C-SPAN site. I want to watch this hearing. But the only one that comes up is the one on April 1st. So this is media suppression of the worst kind. And I can only conclude that people at high levels said, oh no, we're not going to let those people say those kinds of things again at a second hearing. The first hearing was bad enough, but they learned which names were going to speak the day before in a press release. And they learned that it was going to include Dr. Don Curtis from Parkland Hospital. It was going to include Dan Hardway from the HSCA, and it was going to include me, along with 2 others. And I think somebody said, oh no, we're not going to have testimony by experts that contradict the Warren report. That's, obviously, the media in this country decades ago made a decision that this is unhealthy talk for our society. It's unhealthy to question the federal government. It's unhealthy to question authority. And so they won't cover honest, rational dissent anymore at all. The only thing they'll cover every November is 1 or 2 half crazy researchers who say stupid things just to shoot them down or employ ridicule. So they weren't going to let this be on television. And so I want to praise Forbes breaking news, because Forbes breaking news on the internet did an end run on ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, and C-SPAN. They did an end run, and they started posting the 10-minute segments. So first they posted Don Curtis, his 10-minute segment. And a week later, they posted mine. A week after his. I now have over 1.1 million views on my 10 minutes of basic testimony.
On one hand, I'll say there is the star power of Oliver Stone, right? So that could explain perhaps why there was way more coverage on April 1st. But the idea that C-SPAN wouldn't cover it is insane.
That's the tell right there.
Yeah, I think so. It would make sense to me if, even Fox News or, News Nation, this is, Newsmax, some of these places that they go, yeah, we're not going to do this again, because if we cover this one, we're going to have to get into the details. And, you can cover the Oliver Stone one. And it's like, hey, remember this guy? He made a movie called JFK, and it's got all these famous actors in it. Yeah. So you can kind of think about the star more. Whereas
I'll say one thing about Fox News. They did not join the hearing live until halfway through my testimony. That's when they cut in. And I was more than halfway finished with my 10 minutes. So they missed Dr. Curtis from Parkland. Mm-hmm. They missed Dan Hardway. And they missed Judge Thunheim sitting next to me, my former big boss at the review board. Right. And they only got the last of my 10 minutes. And then because they cut in late, everybody got to listen to the person sitting on my left, Mrs. Gerald Posner. I'm being facetious. Okay.
Oh, yes.
A mainstream historian who said she was uncomfortable by everything she'd heard at the hearing. And that she was uncomfortable because she labeled it conspiracy theory, which of course is a total cop-out. The mainstream historians and the mainstream media will not debate evidence with serious JFK researchers, because they can't debate us and win. They won't debate evidence. They'll dismiss it by calling it conspiracy theory, which is using the term invented in 1967 by the CIA to counter critics of the Warren Commission. So they've fallen into this trap, and it was pretty disgusting what she said, but nobody remembers what she said, and nobody was listening that day. She was the minority witness called by the Democrats, believe it or not, by ranking member Garcia. The rest of us were called by Luna and her staff.
Sure. Yeah. It is interesting that representatives of the mainstream media throw the conspiracy theorist bomb, and then they evacuate the premises before they have to talk about any of the detailed evidence.
That's right. So it's intellectually dishonest from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. And they just don't know. And here's a good example of that. Fall of 2023, there's a place called the Mercantile Library in Cincinnati that basically hosts, literary events, debates, etc. And they asked me to put together a debate. They wanted a sort of a conspiracy guy and a mainstream guy. And so I had DeEugenio coming in, and they're asking, can we find anyone to debate him? Is there any history professor? We'll put him up in a hotel. We'll give him a $500 honorarium, and all they got to do is speak for an hour and a half at a debate. I contacted 10 different university history departments that were the closest to Cincinnati. Yeah. None of them got back to me. So
that means those people are afraid. I'd love to see you debate Larry Sabato from Virginia, because he accuses us all of magical thinking. So, I mean, that's just very pejorative. That's almost the same as saying conspiracy theorists. So,
well, there are certainly inference splits at certain points. You go, oh, you look at this evidence, you could say this or this and whatever. But there's just, as you know, you've studied this as your whole life. Like after a certain point, it adds up beyond the realm of possibility for mere coincidence. Anyway, hey, let's. It's fun talking to you, Doug, because we could just sit here and keep agreeing with each other all day. When you started on the ARRB, 27 years ago, and this is a hard way to word this question, but
actually 30 years ago I started.
30. Wow. Okay,
27 years ago I finished.
Finished. Yeah. So even did you think that even after the statutory deadline passed for all the records to come out, that they still would not be released? I mean, are you surprised how things have played out?
No, I'm surprised. And I knew the review board members, the board members, were doing their job by either releasing things immediately, because the standard was presumption of immediate release unless you meet one of the requirements in the act for withholding something. So that had to be, sources and methods, or the safety of an individual.
Right.
Embarrassment to the government was not one of the valid reasons to withhold information. So it had to be something serious. Ongoing operations, sources and methods, or danger to an individual, basically were the only three reasons allowed to withhold something. So they had either released things immediately, or with the objections of, for example, the FBI and the CIA for the most part, or they had said, okay, we're going to release this. We want this released in 2006 or 2007 or whatever. But I expected that the archives would do its job. That was a mistake. And I expected that at the end of the 2017 deadline, that the archives would comply, the government, meaning the executive branch, the archives would comply and release everything else that had not been released in the meantime.
Right.
And so recently, to my shock, I mean, it was bad enough to hear the news releases since 2017. First, President Trump saying, I'm going to release everything. And then he's approached by Mike Pompeo, the head of the agency, and then Trump flips, as he often does about everything. He flips and says, oh, no, now I can't do that. If you saw what I saw, you wouldn't release it either. So we can't release this stuff. Too bad. We'll do periodic reviews later, but we're not going to do it now. Well, that was very unsatisfying. And then Biden, decides to side with the intelligence agencies and basically lets them have the authority back to control the records instead of the JFK Act having the authority. The agencies can have the control again. Well, that was totally wrong. And so now we have a Trump executive order, release everything. And I don't know to the extent to which that's happening. I'm sure there are documents that we know exist that the CIA is not going to release. And the question is, will they roll the president again, or will he twist their arm off and force them to release things like the Joannides files? I don't know. So the thing I learned recently, if your audience doesn't know this, they need to know it. I know you know it, but your audience needs to know that Andrew Eiler, this Canadian attorney who's got a brilliant mind, has been to the archives with Jeff Crudell, our mutual friend.
Yeah. And
he's discovered these review board orders. They're called final determination forms or final determination orders, which were placed initially on every redaction. I mean, one page of a document might have 15 redactions in it. Later, instead of issuing a determination form on each redaction, it became one determination form for each document. And so it would list the final orders of the review board. Release it in full now, release it partially now, and release the other sections later. And so the review board, in many cases, according to Andrew, They said, release this document in full or these redactions in 2006, 2007, 2005, whatever. And anything where they didn't give an earlier year was required by law, by the JFK Records Act, to come out in 2017. So he found, to his dismay, this is the short version of the story, because he's written a tremendously detailed article, a 14-page article that's online, but I think Paul Blue has widely disseminated it. Good for him. So that the archives can't find most of the 33,000 final determination forms. He was shown about 470 of them or something by accident. They were in the wrong boxes.
Yeah.
So he discovered these. They can't find the rest of them, 33,000. And he found out that there were hundreds of documents they should have released already, and the archives has not done so. So I only have two questions. Is it incredible incompetence and malfeasance by the archives, not caring? Or are they in cahoots with the intelligence agencies to agree that they're just going to go like this and say, oh, well, we didn't know. We don't. I'm sorry. It just needed to get done. So this thing is not resolved. It's a brewing problem. And until he told me and until he told Judge Thunheim, we didn't know about it. So the archives have not been doing its job.
Sure. Yeah. Andrew Eiler, co-author on JFK Assassination Chokeholds, good friend of mine. And we had him on to talk about this when he first found out about it, and he's continued to do a lot of work on it. He's like a dog with a bone. He's not letting go until he gets to the bottom of it. And he's recently found out that they apparently did not issue any final determination forms in 97 and 98 that were supposed to be attached to the final reports. And whether or not there were any final determination forms issued, he doesn't know. No one knows where they are for the last 2 years. So that's the new thing that Andrew's.
Oh, wait a minute. But he has evidence. He has email from a staffer of ours, Peter Voth, that they were printing thousands of these the last month we were in existence. So don't tell me there weren't any. We were printing them.
So where did they go? Is the question, right?
Yeah. So don't say the review board didn't create them.
Yes.
Were they trashed, destroyed, deep sixed, like the Dallas Casket? Were they deep sixed?
Who knows, right?
Or are they just misplaced by an uncaring National Archives?
Sure.
I don't know.
On the declassification, just quickly to sum up that point, there are because Trump did have this order. And of course, when the order came out, all the news, that day, it's all over the news. Trump has released all the documents now, but the conspiracy theorists don't have anything new. And it's like,
how would they know? I mean,
exactly right. But there are more than 1,000 documents that remain classified or partially redacted. We know that for sure. So, we're told that these are forthcoming, and that's what the committee has told us. That's Jeff Morley is the one who's in the closest contact with the committee. It's what he says they're saying. They are forthcoming. But something that I just found out about from Eiler is that there's this little loophole in the statute where if agencies wanted to give the National Archives documents before the act formally went into effect, they could give those documents to the archives and they would not be given a RIF number. And they would not.
And he told me that apparently a researcher, Joe Backus, discovered that this happened. And so now, how many thousands or hundreds of documents did agencies give to the archives to be sequestered like that?
Right.
And not subject to the JFK Records Act. That's a big story that needs to be researched.
It's just a complete and total mess. And if you want to say, if you want to say, hey, Oswald acted alone, we're going to tie a bow on this, just go forget about it, then, people who have that perspective, the most important.
They shouldn't be afraid to see everything released.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That they should be vociferously pursuing the complete release in an organized way, not this chaotic nonsense that's been going on since day one. But
that's right.
But yeah, that remains an ongoing issue, and we also have the new FBI documents that were found, and those still haven't been declassified. So pretty crazy stuff. Hey, one more thing on classifications that I know this is right in your wheelhouse, the autopsy. So okay, the autopsy photos and X-rays are available. They don't remain classified, but they're not really accessible because of this deed of gift.
That's right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. I'll explain it very quickly so that people do know, understand. They need to understand the structure, how it came about. So Robert F. Kennedy, I'm just going to give you facts here. I'm not going to express an opinion about the rightness or wrongness of some of these things. These are facts. Robert F. Kennedy wrote to Vice Admiral Berkeley, the president's military physician. He had been JFK's military physician when he was a rear admiral. Johnson kept him on, LBJ, and promoted him to vice admiral from 08 to 09, and which means he was in rank above the Surgeon General of the Navy. That's bizarre as hell, that LBJ would promote him to vice admiral when the Surgeon General of the whole Navy was only a rear admiral. That's what LBJ did. It looks like a payoff to me. So I am commenting. Too bad. So anyway, RFK writes Berkeley in 65, in April 65, and says, I want the autopsy materials. They should belong to the family. So whether that's right or wrong, Berkeley complies. So Berkeley goes to the executive office building where the Secret Service safes are. It might have been Robert Bauch's office. I'm not sure about that, but it was in a safe with a combination lock in the executive office building right across the street from the White House. And he makes an inventory of all these things that Robert F. Kennedy wanted: autopsy photos, autopsy x-rays. One of the items was a broken casket handle. And paragraph 9, he did a 9-paragraph inventory. Paragraph 9 included a lot of other stuff, like a stainless steel container, which contained, Berkeley later explained to the House committee, that container had the remains of Kennedy's brain in it, what was left of it. 7 by 8 inches. So, and an original signed autopsy report, and blood and tissue slides of the president, and memos about the development of autopsy photography. That would be kind of important today, because they would probably list people involved and dates, things like that. So then a law is passed subsequent. So that's all turned over to Evelyn Lincoln in the National Archives. I think it was April 26th, 1965. I know it was April 65. Berkeley takes it over there. It's an inventory that's countersigned by Berkeley, I think 3 people in the Secret Service. He goes over there with all these materials, mostly autopsy photos and x-rays. He gives them to Evelyn Lincoln, JFK's secretary for 12 years. She has a courtesy office in the archives, but he doesn't give them to the archives. He gives them to the Kennedy family representative, Evelyn Lincoln, and she doesn't inspect any of it. She's too horrified. She just signs for it. Sometime after that, Congress passes a law that says all assassination-related materials must be the property of the U.S. government. And so the Justice Department ends up approaching the Kennedy family. And the official involved was Harold Rice, R-E-I-S or R-I-E-S. I'm going to call his name Rice. It might have been Reese. I'm going to call him Mr. Rice. So he negotiates with Burke Marshall, the Kennedy family attorney. He says, look, these have to be turned in. Whether it was right or not for you to receive them, they have to be turned in. So, he's told the story. Well, the Kennedy family is very uncomfortable. They don't want to see autopsy pictures in tabloid newspapers and in books. It'll be traumatic to the family. It'll be distasteful. And he says, okay, I got a solution to all this. Don't return them to the Secret Service. Turn them into the National Archives. So this is the Justice Department coming up with this scheme. Turn them into the archives. You can do it with a deed of gift. I'll help you draft it. So he helps them draft the whole structure of this thing. And it gives them, because they're donating this stuff, as if they owned it in the first place, which they never did. I mean, these were created by taxpayer money, by U.S. taxpayers. Some of them were altered by U.S. taxpayers, and some of them were destroyed by U.S. taxpayers. But it's taxpayer property. It was our president, blah, blah, blah. That's how I feel about it, very strongly. So you have it now, so you can donate by deed of gift. You can control whoever sees it in the future for perpetuity. Whoever's allowed to see it, you can control the conditions upon which they see it. And you can control whether they're used or not in a public venue, like whether they're published or not. So part of the deed of gift, which was executed October 29th, 1966, and then the materials were physically transferred 2 days later on October 31st, 66. Part of the conditions were the Kennedy family will decide who gets to see the autopsy photos and x-rays, and you have to be some kind of a medical expert, and you have to pass some bar that means you have a reasonable reason to want to examine them. You have to present your reasons to the Kennedy family attorney, and we'll decide if you meet our bar for, you have a need to see them, and we'll decide whether you get to publish them or not. So that's what it was. The Justice Department engineered this vehicle. And so the problem is, when I'm watching the Larry King talk show on CNN in 1992, and they're talking about this act that Congress is going to be voting on in a few months, Larry King says to Robert Blakey, the former chief counsel for the House Select Committee, their staff director, their second and final staff director, he says, "So is the public going to get to see the autopsy photos?" And Blakey goes, "No." And he didn't seem to have any qualms. His attitude was too bad. He said, "We're going to protect tax information," and which, by the way, that includes earnings information. "We're going to protect tax information, and we're going to protect all deeds of gift. So those prohibitions won't change, and those things will not be publicly released." And that was the end of the discussion on that. So
Interesting.
And then he bragged, and he took credit for it. He says, "I wrote the JFK Records Act. I put that in there." Okay, thanks a lot, pal. So that's why part of my testimony was to say the deed of gift should be reexamined and lifted, because it's become a de facto agent of suppression.
Right.
So, for example, David Mantic, who's been to the archives 9 times, and Mike Chesser, another MD, who's been to the archives 5 times, once somebody decided, somebody who's the watchdog for the Kennedy family, decided they didn't like what they were writing, or somebody else in the government didn't like what they were writing, and maybe they whispered something in the Kennedy family ear, they can't see the stuff anymore. So they're now banned. And so the Kennedy family's been running hot and cold on this for years, and now it's time to stop.
Right.
Come on. Autopsy photographs, as horrible as they are, they've actually been colorized, made more lurid, and they've appeared in tabloid newspapers a couple of times, 2 or 3 times. They've appeared in all the books now. All the, there's a color bootleg set and a black and white bootleg set. They've all appeared in all the books now. All the ones where we have a bootleg photo, they've appeared in the books and in tabloid newspapers. So you can't say I'm protecting that anymore. It's already happened.
Right.
So if the deed of gift is lifted, then I think we might have, I would like to see 3 or 4 independent panels each year, set up by independent researchers. They can bring their own experts with them. Don't let the government assign experts. That's the kiss of death. The fix will be in. Let the researchers bring their own experts, do their own photographic examinations, X-ray examinations, publish their own conclusions. This might go on for 4 or 5 years. So what? Right. Let it happen. And I predict to you, after 4 or 5 years of that, there would be a true consensus.
Sure. Well, and we're probably not going to get to it today, but a lot of the, during the times that Mantic and Chesser did have access, they really were able to find out some earth-shattering revelations, and so that's probably why they don't want it anymore. Hey, if you could, Doug, just because my listeners know that you're the guy, you're the expert on the medical records, and they know that your general theory of the case, and not just a theory. I mean, this is a theory that's informed by all of your years of work and primary evidence. But that you come from a theory of there's 2 different procedures that happened, or there's something happened in between when Kennedy left Parkland and when the 8 o'clock official autopsy occurred. Can you kind of just fill in the audience on your overall perspective?
I'd love to give you my overview after more than 3 decades of detailed research. And I think my detailed research began as a private citizen in 1993. That's when I attended my first symposium, and it was tremendous. It was the 30th anniversary of the event. That's when Dealey Plaza is dedicated as a National Historic Landmark. That was my first conference. There were over 600 people who attended, and there were great debates on stage, pro and con, between Warren Commission supporters and independent researchers who were not Warren Commission supporters. It was fantastic, a great learning experience. A lot of my favorite authors were there. So then I began getting real serious about doing research on my own, because Stone's movie had just come out, and I was rereading books and reading books I hadn't read yet and rereading. So Then I get my job at the review board in 95. So since then, it's been off and on with a few interruptions due to burnout, full-time interest and more or less full-time thinking about this. So look, it's clear to me that the Secret Service's job, I'm going to give you some basic conclusions about which I frame my understanding of what happened at the autopsy. It starts at Parkland. It's clear to me that the Secret Service had orders not to allow an independent, honest autopsy at Parkland Hospital because Dr. Rose wanted to do one. And of course, Manchester's written about it. And strangely, Manchester was very hostile to Dr. Rose. He's the only author I know of who was hostile to Dr. Rose, as if he was some kind of a ghoul or macabre person. Dr. Rose was trying to comply with Texas law to do an autopsy in the state of Texas and not let an organization which did not have jurisdiction over the shooting, to not let the Secret Service or the FBI take the body before an autopsy, because it was not a federal crime to shoot the president. It was a state crime. It's called homicide, murder. So, of course, the Secret Service exposed weapons and cursed at Dr. Rose and threatened him and said, if you don't get out of the way, we'll run you over with the casket. That's one of the recollections of Dr. Peters, who said that on the men who killed Kennedy. He was there. And Aubrey Reich talked about it on the men who killed Kennedy. He's never seen that much profanity in his life. It was very disturbing. And it's in front of the widow who's got her hand on the casket. I guess the casket's on a church truck, a wheeled conveyance, and it's being jerked back and forth. And the crucifix almost falls off the top of the casket. And, they say, we'll run you over with the casket. And they push Rose up against the wall and essentially, more or less, hold him against the wall, or maybe they start to throttle him. I don't know. One account says that one of them showed a submachine gun. The other ones pulled their coats aside and showed their handguns in the holsters. So they steal the body, and against the requirements of the law, which was to do an autopsy in Texas. I conclude that those are their orders. So, look, David Lifton asked a lot of great questions over the years, but he did not come up with a lot of good answers. He asked all the right questions. A lot of his answers I have written and stated many times were the wrong answers, but he asked the right questions. So the questions were, why do the Parkland descriptions of the head wound differ so much from the autopsy photographs and from the recollections of most of the autopsy witnesses at Bethesda? So why do the descriptions made in the treatment notes by the Parkland treating physicians and their sworn testimony the next year in 1964, why are they so diametrically opposed to most of the autopsy photos and most people who are at the autopsy? So those were the right questions to ask. And so one thing I'm sure of today, and it's important that I get a chance to say this, I'm not a Liftonite. I'm not a member of a cult, and I never was. So I tried to tell David Lifton many times, and this is why we cut off contact with each other in the year 2000 and didn't talk much after that, because I said, David, wounds on the body were not tampered with before the body arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Kennedy arrived with the same wounds he had on his head and on his body, I'm convinced, that he had when he left Parkland. And there were 4 witnesses to prove that. And very quickly, those 4 witnesses are Tom Robinson of Gawler Funeral Home, Captain Canada, the CEO of the treatment hospital at Bethesda, Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist, and finally, Dr. Berkeley, who spoke to 2 researchers, in later years, Henry Hurt and Michael Kurtz, and told both of them that Kennedy had an exit wound in the back of his head, and that he didn't believe that the Warren Commission had the number of headshots correct. Of course, they only had 1 headshot. And then when those 2 researchers called him back for follow-on, he cut them both off at the knees and said, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Don't call me anymore. We're not going to talk about this now. So he was a very, very conflicted guy. I think he was in charge of the culling of the collection of the autopsy photos. I think he was the one in charge of the developing that weekend. We know that from the HSCA deposition of Robert Knudsen. So he was in charge of saying, you go develop these photos, you go develop these photos. And I think that went on all weekend. And then other records indicated it continued through the next week. up to and including the following Thursday. So I think he's the one that decided what is going to stay in the collection and what's not going to be put in the official collection. And so he's a very conflicted guy. So anyway, one of the things I think Lifton got wrong is that he thought the body's wounds had been tampered with before the body arrived at Bethesda. And he actually thought the brain had been removed before the body arrived at Bethesda. And he actually thought that, now this is magical thinking. This is what Larry Sabato would call magical thinking. He thought that the head had somehow been reconstructed by reconstructive surgery to fool the X-ray machine and to fool the autopsy camera. And I just think that's utter nonsense. So Cyril Wecht destroyed that argument years ago, saying there's nobody who could do such reconstructive surgery and actually fool the pathologist at Bethesda, because Lifton's main thing was to say that the doctors weren't liars, but that the body lied to the Bethesda doctors, that the body lied to Humes and Boswell because the body had been tampered with and then reconstructed to fool the camera and the X-ray machine. I think all that's nonsense. It was the wrong conclusions he came up with. But the one thing I want to give him credit for, besides focusing us on the head wounds as the primary focus, that was good. That's a good thing Lifton did. His work on multiple casket entries, I think, was very important. And with one minor exception, I think it stands up well today. So he documented that well. It's one hell of a puzzle, and the evidence is real, and it means something. So this is something I'm going to get into. I'm going to continue to answer your question in just a moment, but I've been working on a major new project, a YouTube documentary with a new research partner of mine who I met last November in Dallas. He's a retired Army officer and he's an amateur editor. He's a very good editor. And we're trying to complete this project within the next month. And then it's going to be posted on YouTube, certainly sometime in July. And it's going to address all of what I explained during my testimony on May 20th as the chain of custody problems with the president's body. The fact that that was part of my laundry list of problems with the medical evidence that I talked about in my 10 minutes. So then fortunately, Chairwoman Luna asked me during the Q&A, what did you mean when you said there was a chain of custody problem with the president's body? And she had the patience. I want to commend her. She had the patience to allow me to give a 4.5 or 5 minute answer, even though she said, okay, this is my last question for you, because I want to move on to Mr. Abraham Bolden. But I want to ask you one more thing real quickly. And so she asked me that question. She let me answer it for 4.5 or 5 minutes. And I gave the most concise answer I could within the venue of the hearing, which is the questioning was going kind of long. This was the end of my questions from her. So I had to say it as concisely as I could. So this program that's going to be released sometime in July by my partner and I on YouTube is going to address in what we consider a very responsible manner all these questions that Lifton raised about chain of custody problems with the body and why it's important. And we're going to list all the real evidence that we can list. And I'm talking about eyewitness testimony, corroborating eyewitness testimony, at least double attestation, if not triple, documents, contemporaneous documents, sworn testimony on audio tape, lots of photographs. And so I think this will really move the ball farther down the field and getting people to accept the fact that, hey, this body of JFK really did arrive at Bethesda Naval Hospital before the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base arrived. So I would say, please stay tuned for that. I have a YouTube channel. It's, get ready to write this down, folks. It's at Douglas Horne, JFK Assassination. So there's no spaces there. At Douglas Horne, capital D, capital H, capital JFK Assassination, capital A. And then people will get to watch it at least 2 or 3 times and absorb what we're telling them, because it's going to be very information dense.
Sure.
Before they begin to try to tear it apart and criticize it. At least they can watch it 2 or 3 times and really learn something. So We think it's going to be a major contribution to this problem. So yes, I do believe the body arrived way too early at Bethesda. And I'm just going to cut to the chase here. And after I'm going to cut to the chase and say, I think it arrived by helicopter. And I know you want to ask me, what is my best evidence for that? And I will address that in a minute, Matt, I promise. But that's the short version I want to give you right now, that it arrived 20 minutes by helicopter before the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade. And as everybody knows, on national television that night, everybody watched on their black and white TVs a large, very dark, chocolate brown, polished, heavy bronze Dallas burial casket. Very heavy item, over 400 pounds empty, offloaded from Air Force One by a hydraulic lift, offloaded, clumsily put into the back of a gray Navy cardiac ambulance. That's not a hearse. That was a cardiac ambulance sent to the airplane by Captain Canada because of a rumor that LBJ had a heart attack. Mm-hmm. So she said, we'll go in that. So in doing so, she destroyed a covert operation to move his body there by helicopter, which had already been established. So, and so the main point of my answer, and then I'll get back to the helicopter question. The main point of my answer, what is the chain of custody problem you talked about, Mr. Horne, when I answered Chairwoman Luna, was that it certainly appears, based on a host of evidence over 3 decades of research by me, that wounds were altered, but not until after the body arrived at Bethesda. And they're only altered to remove metal from the body. So the body's a crime scene. And the entrance wounds and exit wounds on a body, of course, Lifton was right about one thing. They do form a diagram of the shooting. Where do bullets go in? And some bullets don't come out, but the bullets that go in and come out, you can put a probe in those things and determine angles and directions. And so I believe that all the metal fragments, bullet fragments that anybody could find were removed from his body before the autopsy of record started at 8 o'clock. And in fact, the FBI said in their report that the first incision, that's the first one they knew about, okay, because they weren't allowed into the morgue until shortly after 8 o'clock, believe me. So the first incision they knew about and that they saw with their eyes was the Y incision in the chest. And that was at 8:15. So I think all the metal that anybody could find in his body was removed before the autopsy began. That included removal of 1 bullet from the back, from the thorax. There are 3 witnesses to that. Removal of many bullet fragments from the cranium. One was a vial of 10 tiny fragments from the top of the brain. The witness for that is Tom Robinson, the mortician. Other fragments removed from the brain, apparently from the brain, although one of them might have been the throat shot, but 3 of those 4 large fragments were removed, probably from the cranium, because anyway, Dennis David, the Navy corpsman, typed the receipt for 4 large bullet fragments, more mass than 1 bullet, less mass than 2 bullets, but big fragments. He typed the receipt for the federal agent. The agent took the receipt, the carbons, the typewriter ribbon out of the typewriter, took the receipts with him, and they were never entered in the official record. Neither was the vial of 10 tiny fragments, which Tom Robinson saw. Neither was the bullet removed from the thorax. So, hey, this, at the very least, this is obstruction of justice and reason to have no confidence in the ensuing autopsy report. If all of that evidence was not introduced into the record, then why should we have any confidence in the autopsy report? So, before I get back to the helicopter, which I believe was used, I will just say this. One of the statements I made in my testimony was that the autopsy report in the archives today is only the 4th set of conclusions arrived at by the Bethesda pathologists. And there were 4 sets of conclusions within 2 weeks after his death, within approximately 2 weeks. And so that autopsy report in the archives today is not dated. And it was first shown to outsiders on December 11th by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore at Parkland Hospital. And that was his kind of not so subtle, snarky, nasty way of saying to the Dallas doctors, You're wrong. See, this report says the president didn't have an entrance wound in his throat, like you guys said he did. He had an exit wound in his throat. That's what the autopsy report says. So, but that's the final set of conclusions. And that fourth and final set of conclusions, that was the very first time that the autopsy pathologist ever said or wrote that a bullet transited from his back and came out the front of his neck. That's the first time they ever said that. The 3 times previous to that, they never said that. So it was my job to study the chain of custody of the autopsy report at the review board. I spent 2 weeks doing this, looking at receipt trails and chain of custody and which version and this, that, and the other. And so I know what I'm talking about here. And if you're not persuaded when I say the fourth set of conclusions, please watch my narrated PowerPoint on my YouTube channel. It's called The Evolving JFK Autopsy Report. It's only 1 hour long. That's pretty short for Doug Horne. It's only got like 15 slides or something, 12 or 15 slides. But I talk about it in depth, and you'll see the reasons why I say there were 4 sets of conclusions. And so that alone, the fact that there were 4 sets of conclusions, tells you that the doctors weren't interested in truth. They were very malleable and what would satisfy their bosses, what would satisfy the power structure, and what could be sold by the power structure to the American people, because they had a serious problem. And I'm talking about the cabal, the coup that killed President Kennedy. I'm saying, yeah, they want to have a cover up for 2 reasons. They don't want to get caught, but mostly they want to persuade the American people that, okay, all we've got in evidence is a rifle and 3 shell casings. I call it the stage prop rifle and the stage prop shell casings, one of which is so badly dented that it couldn't have been fired that day.
Right.
So they've got a problem. They've got too many wounds and not enough bullet casings to justify those wounds. So that's why the conclusions kept changing 4 different times. You can read about it in the Evolving JFK Autopsy Report. And of course, that part of this nonsense that's invented to try to cram 10 pounds into a 5-pound sock is the single bullet theory later. But now.
Real quick, if I could, you mentioned evidence that Tom Robinson saw the 10 little bullet fragments, and Dennis David also saw more fragments. So
there's more. I'm sorry. Go ahead, but go ahead. I should have said more.
There are more witnesses, but Robinson and David, what they saw,
surgery.
That would be the first one. So they were commenting on something that happened prior to the.
I don't want to call the first procedure an autopsy because it was just sanitizing a crime scene. So the most important thing I forgot to mention is that we have 2 witnesses to postmortem surgery on Kennedy's cranium before the autopsy record starts at 8 o'clock. And the 2 witnesses are Tom Robinson of Gawler's Funeral Home, who arrived with the body early, when it was first delivered, too early and in the wrong car. It was delivered too early. And because that means it didn't come from the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade. And in the wrong car, a black hearse, not a gray Navy ambulance. And so he recalls, and he told the House committee in 1977, I saw the doctor saw the skull open to get the brain out. Well, okay, that's what you would expect. The trouble is Humes always denied that he saw the skull open to get the brain out. He always told this absurd fairy tale that I never had to perform a craniotomy. I never had to remove the skull cap to remove the brain. And in fact, James Jenkins, after 8 o'clock, the other Navy corpsman, Paul O'Connor and James Jenkins said Humes had an excited oral utterance at the autopsy shortly after 8 o'clock. My God, the damn thing's fallen out in my hands. So Jenkins hears Humes say that in front of a very large audience of 30 to 35 people in the morgue gallery. And of course, he did not see Humes perform a craniotomy, and he did not see Humes cut the spinal cord, which you would need to do to remove a brain. You have to cut the optic nerves too, and some other structures underneath, but mostly you have to cut the spinal cord. So when Jenkins is infusing the brain and it's upside down in a formaldehyde bucket, he noticed that, oh, the brainstem has been cut. The spinal cord's been cut by a scalpel, uneven cuts on both sides. So then he knows somebody has cut it, but he didn't see Humes do it. And so Humes says, "Oh, it's fallen out of my hands," like it's a big surprise to him. And so Jenkins started saying in public, to my knowledge, in 2013, that he came to the conclusion years later that this brain had to have been removed earlier that night, and that the only reason to have done so would have been to remove evidence from the brain, bullet fragments, because he's trying to infuse the brain, which is upside down in a bucket, with gravity feed of formaldehyde. So it's soaking in formaldehyde, but he's got a carboy, a big container called a carboy, on top of a cabinet. He's got 2 lines of gravity feed coming down. He's trying to inject the brain, which is upside down, through the carotid arteries with gravity feed formaldehyde going through what's left of the brain's arteries at the same time while it's soaking. And he's having a real hard time inserting these needles because he says the arteries were already shriveling and retracting into the brain. And he says that was the other reason that made him believe, oh, this has been removed earlier this evening. So anyway.
But that's proof of a prior.
Yes, it is.
And also he would know, right?
And so the second witness to surgery that there was cranial surgery is X-ray technician Ed Reed, who said this under oath to the review board. And to make a really long story short, it's in my book. Reed witnesses Humes take a scalpel and make a very wide cut in the scalp, right above the hairline, right up here, horizontal cut, and then take a circular bone saw and bear down on the skull right under that and start to cut the bone right here. Well, that's where the top of the head's missing in the autopsy photos. It begins right here, above the forehead and right where the hairline begins. And then somebody realized that he and Custer are still in the morgue. And they said, "What are you guys doing here? Get the hell out of here. Go upstairs to the X-ray lab. We'll call you back when we need you." So they're summarily dismissed. So he sees this happening and he identifies Humes by name. So Robinson sees this cutting open the skull to remove the brain, and he drew a diagram for us with the round wound in the back of the head and dotted lines above and below it. We said, "What are the dotted lines?" And he told the review board staff in 1996, "Oh, that's where the doctors sawed the skull open to get the brain out." "Oh, really? Okay." So then Ed Reed identifies the culprit by name. So there's not only a lot of bullet fragments that we know were removed that were never put in the record, but we have 2 witnesses to cranial surgery. So illicit postmortem surgery, which clearly happened before 8:00 p.m. because none of the witnesses after 8:00 saw Dr. Humes performing a skull cap removal. None of them saw him using a saw on the skull. And in fact, Dr. Humes lied to Dr. Fink. When Fink arrived at the autopsy late at 8:30, if you believe Fink's notes to General Blumberg, he had these typed notes he had made over the years, and he gave them to General Blumberg at the AFIP, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, where Fink worked. I think Blumberg was transferring out, so he wanted Fink's notes. So Fink gave him his typed notes, and they've become part of the record since then. And his notes said, "Dr. Humes called me at 8:00, and then I arrived at the morgue at 8:30. So later discussions, I think it was the Shaw trial, Fink revealed that, well, when Dr. Humes called me at 8, I was at home and he told me, "We have a good set of skull films already." Oh, that's crucial, because you can't have a good set of skull films unless you've examined the skull first, taken skull x-rays, and then taken them upstairs to be developed and brought them down 30 minutes later to be examined, to have the x-rays read by the radiologist. Then you would make the phone call to Fink and say, "It's 8:00, come on down and help us." So Fink arrives at 8:30. Humes lies to him, and he says, no sawing of the skull was necessary. So Fink arrives, the lungs are removed, the heart's removed, and the brain's already removed. So Humes tells him a lie. We know it's a lie because of what Tom Robinson witnessed and what Ed Reed witnessed. But Humes has to say the same thing to Fink that is witnessed by the big audience after 8:00. So they did not see Humes use a saw on the skull. They saw the brain fall out in his hands. So he had to tell Fink this lie, and Fink memorialized it in his notes, which I think is wonderful. So, okay. So if you're talking to Doug Horne, your first question is going to be, okay, if you think you're saying the body arrived 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base, which had the bronze Dallas casket in it. Why do you say that? Okay, of course, the best evidence, many of your listeners will already know, is the Boysen report. Boysen was the sergeant in charge of the Marine security detail from Marine Barracks. He and his men arrived at 1800 hours, 6 p.m. They reported to Admiral Galloway their job was physical security for the autopsy, to keep the newsmen and others away. Their job was not, they were not the honor guard. That was called the Joint Service Casket Team. These guys were physical security, and that was the only reason they were there. So he writes a report the day after the funeral, November 26th, and he says, the casket arrived at approximately 1835 hours and was taken in. And he says a lot of other things. You know, there was confusion about which entrance was going to be used. There were hostile encounters with newsmen, and Marines were seen double timing back and forth between different places in the hospital. It was really intriguing. So anyway, a researcher made us aware that he had written a report. Kathleen Cunningham, the nurse who wrote a big article with Gary Aguilar in 2003, how 5 investigations got it wrong, the medical evidence. She told us about this lead, that this guy existed and he had a report and we should try to get it from him. So in 1997, we did. And I interviewed him on the phone. He confirmed he had a report. He had been in charge of the security detail. I said, will you give us the document, your original? He said, no, I won't. It's too precious to me. He said, I have an onion skin carbon copy. You know, it was made by a piece of carbon paper between the original and this particular onion skin piece of paper. He said, I don't want to part with it, but I will make a very good photocopy for you. I'm authenticating it to you now on the phone. I'll write a letter that authenticates it when I send you the photocopy. So I was totally satisfied with that. So was Jeremy Gunn, my boss. So, you know, we got the letter in the mail, and he made clear to me on the phone and in his letter that he didn't remember much about the details anymore in 1997 of that night, but that he stands by everything he put in the report. And it's a contemporaneous document written on November 26, 63. That's the same day Seibert and O'Neill wrote their report of what they overheard and witnessed during the autopsy. They're both written on November 26th. So that's a very powerful piece of evidence. And the thing is, what that does is that assigns a precise time to the event remembered by Dennis David, Navy corpsman, and by Mr. Reventish, another Navy corpsman, who I believe was in Dennis David's working party. So Dennis David was an HM1, first-class Navy corpsman. HM means hospitalman. HM1 is an E6. So he was filling the billet of chief of the day for the medical school at Bethesda. And he was told to assemble a working party. The Secret Service told him, because the president will be arriving later. So then at some point they say, your visitor's arriving, get your people down there. So he has a working party of sailors. They assemble at the morgue loading dock, and they see 6 or 7 men in suits get out of a black unmarked hearse. That's a funeral home mortuary ambulance, a hearse. You know, there's no markings on it. There's no escort car with it. And they help what they presume was Secret Service remove a shipping casket, a cheap metal box used to move bodies on planes and trains and airplanes. You know, it's just a transport coffin used for public transportation of remains. So they remove this and put it in the morgue anteroom, the chill boxes outside the morgue proper. And then he and his men leave. They don't see it open. He goes up to the front of the hospital, and he consistently told David Lifton in 1979 and 1980 that he said to Lifton, I would say 15 or 20 or 30 minutes went by. I'm looking out the window in the commanding officer's office before, this is after the hearse delivers the shipping casket, 15 or 20 or 30 minutes go by before he sees the Andrews Air Force Base motorcade arrived with the gray Navy ambulance in the Dallas casket. And he tells Lifton in 79 and 80, that's how I knew the Dallas casket had to be empty, because we had just offloaded the president's body at 6:35. So it turns out that, and Donald Rubentish has verified these basic facts, that it was a shipping casket and that it was a hearse. So when I interviewed Dennis David in 1997, years later, he estimated that there was maybe 30 minutes between the hearse and the shipping casket and the arrival of the Andrews motorcade. So in his mind, it was, well, maybe 30 minutes. And maybe I was down there at 6:40 or 6:45, it was maybe 30 minutes before the motorcade out front. So the Boysen report reveals it was exactly 20 minutes. Boysen says the casket arrived at 18:35. That's 20 minutes before the motorcade arrived at 6:55. And you can take that to the bank. Clinton Hill put it in his written report November 30th. Paul Landis put it in his written report November 30th. And the newspapers confirmed it. So, and then the thing sits there, and it sits there. And one newspaper account says the gray ambulance sat there for at least 12 minutes after Jackie Kennedy went in the front door before moving. So there's a big separation in time between the time the hearse arrives at 6:35 and the time this gray Navy ambulance with a bronze casket in first moves. Now, so the real question is, and then I'll get to the helicopter. The real question is Doug Horne inferring that that's the president's body? No, I'm not. That wouldn't be good enough. Dennis David made it clear to David Lifton and to me in 1997 that he asked Dr. Boswell, who was very open at that time and was very open with people and would engage and talk to anybody. He wasn't a closed personality hiding behind a wall of authority like Dr. Humes always was. Boswell used to be an open, gregarious person. So Dennis David asked him shortly after the autopsy. It was either shortly after midnight or the middle of the next day. He asked him, was that the president in the casket that I offloaded last night? And Boswell said, yes, the president was in the casket that you and your sailors offloaded. And of course, Dennis David made clear that Humes was there in the loading dock. Boswell was there. All kinds of people. Captain Stover was there. The heads of surgery for the Navy, Air Force, and the Army were there. And of course, some of Boysen's Marines were there, or he wouldn't have been there to write a report. So my point is, I completely trust Dr. Boswell. I have no reason to question what he told Dennis David. Why would he lie about it? So it was later that Dennis David told my girlfriend, Beverly Sadowski. He told her later that, years later, he told her in 2014, I think it was, at a conference. He told her that, and subsequently, starting with a couple of weeks after the Kennedy autopsy, Boswell's personality completely changed. He was no longer an open person who was easy to talk to. He didn't want to talk to anybody anymore. And Dennis David's words were, he acted like he was compromised. So I think they were compromised. I think Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell received an in-brief before Kennedy's body arrived from higher authority. And I'm assuming the higher authority would have included Admiral Kenny, Rear Admiral, the Surgeon General of the Navy, and Rear Admiral Galloway. They're both Rear Admirals. Rear Admiral Galloway, the head of the Bethesda complex. And they might have had some men in suits there with them while this briefing happened, like men from the CIA, for example. And I believe they were told something like this. It would have been the same cover story that Johnson used on Earl Warren to force him to serve on the Warren Report when Warren didn't want to. It would have been something like this. We know the president was killed by a crossfire in Dealey Plaza. We know that. Secret Service knows that. We know the communists did it. We know that. The communists, the boogeyman. We even have one of the communists arrested. And we can't tell the American people the president was killed by the communists in Dealey Plaza, by a crossfire. If we did, we'd have World War III. So I'm sure they were told, it's your duty. This is my conclusion after decades of research. I believe they were told it's your duty to not report any shots from the front and only to report shots from behind. And in doing so, you will be doing your patriotic duty and preventing World War III. And by the way, it's an order. You don't really have a choice. So I think this is the reason why the government didn't want the autopsy conducted by the preeminent civilian experts in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins or in New York City. They could have brought those people to Washington. The best forensic pathologists in the world at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and at New York City. No, they not only want it done in Washington by these two Navy guys that are not forensic pathologists. They're just ordinary hospital pathologists who have been administrators for years, and they really don't do autopsies anymore. And they don't do gunshot wounds as a matter of course. I think Humes had only done 2 gunshot wound autopsies in his entire life. And I don't know about Oswald, almost none. So, and I believe that Humes was probably also told, if you can remove or eliminate any evidence of frontal shots, you should do that too. So, you're going to have a chance to do a pre-examination. And they probably told him, we'll take pictures of what he really looks like when he arrives, but it's your job to remove evidence of shots from the front, remove all the bullets you can, and only report shots from behind. I think that's exactly what happened. And here's proof that I'm right. So the Air Force One tapes reveal that General Ted Clifton, Kennedy's Army aide, his so-called military aide, the Army 2-star general who was his military aide, and Admiral Berkeley, who's a Navy Rear Admiral, they both wanted the autopsy to be at Walter Reed Hospital. Even Berkeley, who was Navy. And I know why. Because Walter Reed Hospital is co-located with the AFIP, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which has military forensic experts working there who are forensic pathologists and forensic radiologists and forensic neurologists. So I interviewed a man who was ready to do the autopsy on Kennedy at Walter Reed, Dr. Dick Davis. I interviewed him in 97. And he confirmed to me that he was ready to go. He had his whole team assembled at Walter Reed. He was ready to do the craniotomy, remove the skull cap, take the brain out. He had the cameras ready, all the instruments, the tools, and the body never arrived at Walter Reed. So obviously, at one point, there was a plan to do that. It just didn't go there. And
do we know who overruled?
Yeah, we know. And it's a dirty agency called the Secret Service.
Okay.
I'm giving you my conclusion. Guilty of security stripping in Dallas.
Yes.
So when Kennedy has 18 motorcycles around his car in Houston the day before, and he only has 4 motorcycles near his car the next day in Dallas, and it was going to be 8 until the advance agent Winston Lawson told the Dallas cops a day or two before the Dallas trip, I want you to cut that 8 motorcycles down to 4. And I want you to keep the 4 behind the rear wheels, behind the bumper. So to me, that's security stripping. It's the head of the White House detail of the Secret Service, Jerry Bain. The Air Force One tapes reveal this, overruled General Clifton and Berkeley. It's all over the Air Force One tapes. They lobby twice for an autopsy at Walter Reed and a hearse, a mortuary-style ambulance, which is a hearse for transportation. He overrules them and says, it's going to be at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And twice, he says once to them, and then he says one more time to Roy Kellerman on the airplane. It's going to be choppered, sent by helo to Bethesda. So
there's a record of it saying that?
Oh, yeah. So it's going to be in my little documentary. It's in the Air Force One tapes. It was already in the LBJ library version of the Air Force One tapes, but it's also in the Clifton version, which is several minutes longer. The Clifton version is still edited, but it's got more stuff on it than the LBJ library version did in the 70s. So the Clifton version was released in 2012. It was held by Clifton until he died, and they're still edited, but it's got more stuff on it. And those conversations are very clear. So the tug of war was lost by the honest people who wanted to do a good autopsy at the AFIP, because that's what Walter Reed meant, co-located with the AFP. And Dick Davis was listen to this, he was the acting head of neuropathology at the AFIP on that evening. The head was on a trip. He was the acting head of neuropathology, and he just wasn't allowed to do his job. So, that's because the first person Berkeley spoke to on the Air Force One tapes was General Heaton, the Surgeon General of the Navy. I'm sorry, the Surgeon General of the Army was General Heaton. He's the first one Berkeley spoke to, and that's when he proceeded to set all this up. And when he got Dick Davis to set up his team. But then it was overruled by Jerry Bain, the head of the White House detail. So the last part of this continuing conversation between the White House Situation Room and the airplane, it's made very clear by once Bain changes the location of the autopsy to Bethesda. Then General Clifton says, okay, I'm going to ramp up at the starboard side of the airplane in the darkness. The television lights were going to be on the port side, the left side. I want to ramp for the darkness up at the forward starboard side on the right-hand side. We're going to take the first lady off in secret, and we're going to transport her and all the other passengers to the south grounds of the White House in 3 helicopters. They wanted to separate everybody from the body. And we're going to send them all to the White House on 3 helos. And then, of course, he said, I want to lift at the left-hand tail door for the casket, the heavy casket. And I need another ramp for the forward left-hand door for the passengers. So as Manchester writes, the plane lands on time at 6 o'clock, 1800 hours, military time. At 4 minutes after 6, the plane's on the blocks. It stopped rolling. There was a long 4-minute taxi. 1 minute later, the lift is bringing down, after a lot of struggling with it, they're bringing down the heavy bronze casket. And there's this unseemly tug of war and competition between the Kennedy aides and the Joint Service Casket Team, who's going to load this in the Navy ambulance, because Jackie had seen that and said, we'll go in that. So she disrupted this entire covert operation to separate the president's body from everybody. She disrupts it. The last thing that Gerald Bain said to Kellerman before they landed was, you accompany the body on the helicopter. Well, it'll be in my documentary. Guess what? He had to think pretty quickly. He had to stay with the casket and go with Jackie. I think his job is to make sure that empty casket was not opened in the ambulance by anybody. So Bobby's in the back with Jackie. So I don't have time to go down this rabbit hole with you today. We can do it next year if you want. Yeah. But JFK's body, if you believe the Boysen report, I do. The time is a time. The guy took notes, obviously, or he wouldn't have had times to write down. If you believe Dr. Boswell, bear with me. If you believe Dr. Boswell that Kennedy's body was in the cheap shipping casket that Dennis David offloaded, then he was. That's prime for me. It's a prime piece of evidence. Therefore, his body arrives 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews. Therefore, that casket had to be empty when it's offloaded from the airplane. It's an inescapable conclusion if you believe the Boysen report and if you believe Dr. Boswell. So therefore, to me, that Dallas casket sitting unattended for 12 more minutes after it arrives doesn't have JFK in it.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I was going to say really quick, the big thing that you have said just now that I did not know before that definitely does influence my opinion about the helicopter is this conversation, the record that we have of the basically the chatter, the radio talk on Air Force One in the White House Situation Room. They're already planning.
Yes, it's even better than that.
Yeah,
I've got 2 Army documents that most people aren't aware of. They're in the documentary I'm producing. One of them confirms the helicopter transportation will be used. The second one is gold. It says we called, the Army's making this record, and they recorded it later in the state funeral file, which is in the JFK library. And they said, we called Admiral Galloway. I'm going to give you the civilian times. They use military times. They say 17:30. That's 5:30 p.m. We called Admiral Galloway at 5:30, and we told him the airplane will land at 6 o'clock, which it did. And we told him the ETA, estimated time of arrival, for the body by helicopter at Bethesda is 6:30. 1830. That's in an Army document in the JFK library. They had an ETA for when the body would arrive by helicopter. So,
Well done.
if that's accurate, that explains how the body can arrive at 1835 hours, 5 minutes later after it lands in the Oak Club parking lot, providing Paul O'Connor is correct about that, which he tells William Law in his book. So that's my story of the helicopter. There's another witness, a nurse, who sees a cheap casket removed from a helicopter by men in trench coats. And
Okay.
that was in Vince Palomaro's book. It's from a 1992 radio interview she did with Woody Woodland. And so there's a lot of evidence that comes together like this. So that's my story for today. That's as far as I want to go with it now. On the helicopter transportation, the evidence, I think, is robust, and I believe it.
Okay, good. And yeah, I mean, the Paul O'Connor statement to William Law, I believe he said it was around 8 o'clock that he heard the helicopter. Right?
Okay, let me talk about that.
Okay.
I know where he says it for sure. He says it for sure when he talks to the House committee in 77. So he's the first shipping casket witness. He's qualified to say that because he used to work in a funeral home. So he's using their lingo. So I believe that part. And if he says it was open and the president's in a body bag instead of his body wrapped in a sheet, why should I disbelieve him? The head's wrapped in a sheet, the body's in a zippered body bag. Okay, Paul. Then he says the shipping casket arrived at 8 o'clock. He tells the House committee that. And then he says that in his interview for The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Now, I'm going by memory, but in the William Law interview, which was published in 2004, I recall Paul O'Connor saying, I heard 2 helicopters. One of them landed out front at the helipad. Well, I know which one that was. That was the H-21 banana-shaped helicopter that the casket team came in. And I know when it landed at 6:45. But Paul O'Connor tells William Law, there was another one that landed before that.
Okay.
And it landed in back of the hospital at near the Officers Club parking lot. And we're going to identify for that for you on a map, on an aerial photograph. It's very close to the hospital. And he says, 5 minutes after that, the shipping casket is brought in. So Paul O'Connor told William Law that he thought the shipping casket arrived about 5 minutes after he heard a helicopter land at the Oak Club parking lot. And I don't remember him telling William Law it was about 8 o'clock, but even if he did, look, Paul O'Connor has memory merge going on. So he clearly sees the body when it's first brought in because he remembers a shipping casket and he remembers a body bag, which wasn't used at Parkland. So that's a big chain of custody break right there. And the fact that he remembers 8 o'clock, I think I know what that means. He doesn't see a lot of things that are happening to the body after that shipping casket is opened. He doesn't see a lot of things happening between then and 8 o'clock. The joint casket team brings the president in at 8 o'clock in the Dallas casket. And that's documented in their casket report.
Yeah.
So that's when I think Paul O'Connor sees the head unwrapped, which I don't think he saw earlier in the evening. Yeah. I think he sees the head unwrapped at 8 o'clock. He's shocked because the whole top of the head is missing. Mm. And he says the audience was shocked and disbelieving that a bullet could do that. Yeah. And that's when Humes panics. Humes panics using dissociation. A psychologist told me this and says, well, he's agreeing with the audience. Well, it's obvious there's been surgery of the head area in the top of the skull. That's what you do when you panic. You're agreeing with them, and that way they'll think, well, obviously Humes didn't do it. He's admitting that he's seeing what we're seeing. Because the people in the morgue are professionals. They know the difference between a bullet wound, an exit wound, and surgery.
Yes.
And so I think Paul O'Connor, when he sees this massive defect, which is 5 times bigger than it was at Parkland, I think he's so shocked that that's when he looks up at the clock and the clock says 8 o'clock. And so his mind 14 years later, when the House committee interviews him, it remembers an early event, a shipping casket. It remembers a body bag in the shipping casket. And then it remembers what happened later that night. It remembers the first time he saw the head when it was unwrapped for the second time was the whole top of the head's gone. And it's so shocking that he looks at the clock and that's what he remembers is 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
That's my way of dealing with him. I think it's memory merge. Look, I just want to say one more thing. Both Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins, both corpsmen, normally it was their job to do the craniotomy and remove the brain. Neither one of them removed the brain that night, and neither one of them saw anyone else perform cranial surgery and remove the brain. And yet somebody did, or it couldn't have fallen out in Hume's hands. So there were things they were not witnessing. And this goes to the subject that we might discuss next year, which is that the old morgue was still in use and was used for this clandestine tampering with the body to get all the bullets out of the body. And that the new morgues, the new facility was probably used at 8 o'clock that night for the autopsy of record. And that's why nobody in the new morgue, the big audience, they don't remember seeing sawing on the skull. They don't remember seeing the craniotomy that Tom Robinson and Ed Reed saw. So the fact that some people didn't witness things that other people did, it tells you that, okay, there's a shell game going on here with rooms. And the people need to be prepared for this. I mean, if you're hearing this for the first time, of course, you're going to be a little confused. If you read about a lot of it already, you won't be confused. And you'll say, oh, yeah. So they obviously reintroduced Kennedy's body, people in charge of the cover-up, into the empty Dallas casket after they had done all the removal of all the bullet fragments. After they'd opened up the head, removed all the bullet fragments they could find in the brain, after they'd removed the bullet from the back, from the thorax, after they'd probably removed this bullet, which lodged right on top of the right lung. That's why there was a massive bruise on top of the right lung. It's stuffed. This bullet hit the trachea, tore 3 tracheal wings, went back and stopped. And I think that's where it stopped. It did not exit the body. That's one of these 4 large bullet fragments that Dennis David typed a receipt for. So one would have been thorax. One would have been this bullet, which was diverted and stopped immediately on top of the pleural dome. It did not puncture the lung. And that's why the photos of that massive bruise are not in the record and never have been. Humes went to great trouble to photograph the inside of the lung after it was removed, the inside of the pleural cavity, the inside of the cavity where the right lung used to be, to photograph this massive bruise right here. And John Stringer, the photographer, remembers that because he had to illuminate it. None of those photos made it into the record. And I think the reason they didn't make it into the record, my conclusion, is that this is a frontal shot. That's where that bullet went. And it penetrates the windshield, so it's lost a lot of its kinetic energy. It goes in and tears up the trachea and then stops. That's why it doesn't exit the body.
Yeah.
And that Berkeley and whoever is controlling him, they don't want evidence of any frontal shot in the collection. So, for example, do we see the entry wound high in the forehead above the right eye that 5 different people saw in photographs after the autopsy? I mean, those photos never made it into the official record, but 5 people saw such photographs with an entry wound the size of a dime above the corner of JFK's right eye, way up high. And no, what you do see is a massive red gash, a massive red man-made incision made with a scalpel right over the location where people saw that entry wound in photographs. So that's called removing evidence of a frontal shot. Getting rid of this bullet would include that. So if Dennis David remembers 4 large bullet fragments, one would be from the back, from the thorax. One would be from this large bruise, evidence of this frontal shot. And the other 2 are probably from the skull because the bullet that hit him from behind, that hit Kennedy from behind, did not exit the skull. It did not exit the front of the face. It went straight forward, severely damaged the orbit of the right eye, which is badly fractured. You can see that in my YouTube documentary on the JFK skull x-rays. Boswell noted it in his notes. The globe of the right eye is fractured, but there's no exit wound in the front of his face. Parkland said there was no exit wound in the front of his face. Jackie said from the front there was nothing. So that bullet that went in probably broke up, and the pressure wave fractured the orbit of the right eye.
Right.
But the bullet didn't exit the face. So those are those 4 bullet fragments to me.
Right. And yeah, we've certainly got a whole 2 or 3 more pages of notes and things to talk through.
Not today.
All right, I do want to ask you one more question before we go, and this is just sort of a big picture, zoomed out question. Because right now in season 3 of Solving JFK, we're trying to figure out, okay, if not Oswald, then who? And so obviously we're looking at who's pulling the strings here.
Thank you.
It sounds like Secret Service is involved to a large extent because that Gerald Bain's dictating where it's going to be. That's a crucial decision. Does that mean that, I mean, do we know anything about the mechanics of how the body would have been positioned once it got on the plane to be able to?
Well, yeah, first of all,
I know it's a whole other thing.
I'll answer your second question first, and then I'll give you my overview, which is John's overview.
Please.
One of the things I think Lifton got right, he got a lot of stuff wrong, but one of the things I think he got right was that because the bronze so all he had was Dennis David's story, backstopped by another corpsman, Donald Reventish, that the body arrived about 6:40 or 6:45. They didn't have a precise time, but boy, it was an awfully accurate memory for years later. But he didn't have a document that proved it. Well, the Boysian report, which the review board got, gives that a time. 1835 hours, 6:35 p.m. So therefore, that proves that the bronze, if Kennedy's in the shipping casket, that proves the bronze casket is empty at Andrews Air Force Base. It has to be. So then where was it on the airplane? Well, it did come back on Air Force One. I mean, listen, on the Clifton tapes, the new audio says, one of the items of new audio is Roy Kellerman, the man in the death car in the right front seat, who did nothing during the shooting except watch it out of his rearview mirror on his door and then hunker down and hide. When the bullet goes through the windshield and they start to get what he called a fusillade of shots coming into the car, that's when he went, and so did Greer. They went down like that, and they were hiding instead of trying to protect the president and his wife. So Kellerman's on the radio while the airplane's on the ground at Love Field. And Kellerman, this is on the Clifton tapes. It's gold. He says, he's talking to Jerry Bain. He says, everybody is on board. Well, that means that includes Jackie. She's the last passenger to go on board. The Dallas casket goes on board. It arrives at Love Field at 2:14. It's well documented. By 2:18, 4 minutes later, they've struggled with it up this ramp, crammed it into the tail section of the airplane, into the aft galley, and Jackie followed it immediately. And then she runs to the stateroom to compose herself. She wanted to be alone, for God's sake. And Godfrey McHugh isn't there. He's running up forward to the pilots 4 or 5 times, according to William Manchester, demanding, why are we taking off? Why are we taking off? He's not back guarding the casket yet. He's busy arguing with pilots. LBJ is forced to leave the stateroom and go up to the middle of the airplane where the office is, to leave the bedroom and go up to what he called his stateroom, the office. So anyway, Kellerman says, everybody's on board. That means he's saying this after 2:18 p.m. That's a fact. And then he says, we're all waiting for the judge to arrive for the swearing in. When did the judge arrive? 2:30. That's well documented. And by the way, the swearing in was 2:38. So Kellerman says, everybody's on board. We're waiting for the judge to arrive. And then he says to Jerry Bain, I'll have to call you back after the body. Click. What? So between 2:18, after Jackie and the casket are on board, the Dallas casket, and 2:30, Kellerman says, I'll have to call you back after the body. Now, I know what this would have meant to David Lifton. And to me, this is what it meant for years, that they had 12 minutes to remove his body from the Dallas casket and get it out the starboard aft galley door onto the arms of a forklift, lower it to the ground, and put it in one of the luggage bays. Just hide it. Because I think the fear of the Secret Service was, we don't want the cops showing up with Dr. Earl Rose and demanding a Texas autopsy again. If they show up, they ain't going to get the body. They're going to get an empty casket. And they won't even know the difference until we take off, because it weighs over 400 pounds. They won't even be able to tell. So I think that's the reason this would have been done, so that if Earl Rose showed up and the cops and demanded, we want that casket, there will be an autopsy in the state of Texas, they would have said, okay, assholes, here's your casket. And then the plane would have taken off 2 minutes later. So I think that's why they did that. Yeah. And Jamie Sawa, a great researcher, presented a big presentation at Duquesne University at the first Cyril Wecht conference in 2003, the first conference organized by Ben Wecht, his son. And he took beautiful pictures of the forward and aft luggage compartments, of the dimensions, what they looked like. And he proved there was no trap door in the tail between the tail section and the aft luggage compartment, but there was plenty of room in the tail to lay out a body. There's a big shelf, much longer than 6 feet. And up forward, there's even more room. Of course, half of that's taken up by radio equipment. But so my contention is that after LBJ gave his little speech, he went on board Army One. And a minute after that helicopter took off, all the lights went out. The TV coverage stopped. So that happened at 6:20, I think, 6:20 p.m. So my contention is that at about 6:21, JFK's body is removed from one of the two luggage compartments and put on a helicopter, which had been set up long before, and taken to Bethesda. And that's how it can arrive so early, before the motorcade. It took the motorcade 45 minutes to get there, and yet his body arrives at the morgue loading dock 20 minutes before the motorcade. So there's another possibility now for how the body might have gotten on board the airplane. And I don't know which one is true. So there was a working colleague of David Lifton's named Sean Fetter. It's true. I wrote a very critical review of his book last year or the year before. And he was parroting all this Lifton stuff about the body was tampered with before it got to Bethesda. The brain was removed before it got to Bethesda. I think it's all nonsense. So I criticized those aspects of his book. He also said, you can't learn anything from studying the skull x-rays. It's a waste of time. I said, well, that's really unscientific. That's really stupid too. But there was one good thing in his book that I don't know about. So every book has something good in it, almost every book. So he came up with 2 witnesses to a different casket arriving at Air Force One about half an hour before the Dallas bronze casket, at least half an hour before that. And so his point was that if Kennedy's body was removed from Parkland secretly through these tunnels, the Secret Service was asking, are there secret ways out of the hospital? And they were told, yes, we have tunnels. The question is, did they use them? We don't know. But if they removed his body early, and it went early in this simple casket that Sean Fetter writes about, that could be what's inside this simple casket that arrives at least half an hour before the heavy bronze casket. And the point is, that would have been ground transportation. It would have been easy to take a body from ground transportation directly into a luggage bay, because the luggage bays were open. Lyndon Johnson wanted all of his luggage transferred from Air Force Two to Air Force One. So the luggage bays were open. And I conclude that's the excuse for that, to sequester the body. So because Air Force Two was going to Andrews, and it landed 30 minutes after Air Force One. So, I mean, it wasn't a matter of his luggage getting lost. That wasn't going to happen. His witnesses seem credible if he's telling the truth, Sean Fetter. He says one witness was the pilot of Air Force Two. One witness was the chief stewardess on the Pan Am press plane at Love Field. And then he has a third witness who he says was an Air Force steward in the tail compartment of Air Force One. And he claims the steward told him years ago, I never left the tail compartment, and nobody ever opened the bronze casket ever before the plane took off. So if his 3 witnesses are correct, then that would mean Aubrey Reich, the O'Neill funeral home attendant, was wrong when he has said for years, I put Kennedy's body in the heavy bronze casket. It was wrapped in sheets, the head and the body wrapped in sheets. I could feel the wound on the back of Kennedy's head, the sharp bones. I put his body in there, and my boss closed the lid, and we never opened it again. But if that's not true, and if somehow it was opened and Reich just wasn't aware of it, there is a photo of him standing outside the emergency room having a smoke with peanuts with his assistant. So don't tell me he was there the whole time.
Right.
So if they remove the body when he's out having a smoke, I mean, he was photographed having a smoke outside with peanuts. Then the body could have gone to Love Field earlier. And what that would mean is that You didn't have to do some risky operation of removing a body from a heavy casket and hoping you're not discovered by somebody else on the airplane while you're doing it, and sticking it out a door onto a forklift, lowering it 20 feet to the ground, and then hoping nobody sees you. So the trouble is, the Roy Kellerman statement, I'll have to call you back after the body, that implies that the Lifton version might be right. That the body wasn't removed from the casket until between 2:18 and 2:30. So I know that at the swearing in, Godfrey McHugh had assumed guard over his president. He wouldn't go to the swearing in. He said, my president is here. I'm not leaving him. So from 1 or 2 minutes before the swearing in, Godfrey McHugh was standing guard. And then during the flight, they have an Irish wake and they're surrounding the casket. And of course, nobody opened it during the flight. But the question is, what happened during the 12 minutes between 2:18? So there is uncertainty about how was it put elsewhere on the airplane. And I don't think those things are going to be resolved today unless Sean Fetter comes up with tape recordings and a transcript. He wrote about these things in his book. He didn't provide a transcript of his interviews of those three people. And I would want to hear the tape recordings and then read the transcript and assess their credibility myself before I decide which one of these two possibilities should I believe in. But I know I believe in the Boysen report. And I know that was Kennedy's body because I believe Dr. Boswell. And so therefore, I know it arrived 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews. And therefore, I know that casket was empty when it was offloaded from the airplane at 5 minutes after 8 at Andrews. So you can work backward from there and deal with the ambiguities later, which is what I'm going to do later. But I'm going to deal with all the problems at Bethesda in the best way that I can with all the documentation that I can muster. And I think people will find my documentary that's coming out in July that it'll move the ball forward quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the idea that there was a secondary reason for why they would be moving the body from the ceremonial casket to the shipping casket if they were discovered. Hey, we're trying to hide it from Roll Rose. It's compelling. It's always compelling to me when there's a sort of an Occam's razor reason for why things happen. It's like, oh yeah, there is an Occam's razor, and here's what it shows. Well, hey, appreciate your time very much, Doug. As you know, as I've mentioned to you, I'm a big fan of your work. That was enlightening today. I learned something about the fact that they were planning on the chopper the whole time, and there's proof for that. I mean, that's actually a really big fact. And yeah, let's chat again here sometime down the road next year. And
let's do that next year. Can I close with one final thought?
Please go ahead.
I didn't answer your question on if not Oswald, who. I subscribe totally to the Dr. John Newman thesis that the galactic center of the assassination plot is actually the Pentagon, and that the CIA, while involved with the tactical operation in Dealey Plaza with the tactical ambush, the CIA is the willing handmaidens for the Pentagon. And the whole reason he has come to that conclusion is that you have a Joint Chiefs of Staff who wanted Armageddon, who wanted a nuclear first exchange, an American preemptive strike, a first strike on the Soviet Union 4 different times between 1961 and 64. These guys wanted nuclear war. Kennedy wouldn't give it to him. He kept refusing. And then the 4th time they wanted it was after he was dead. And then Johnson said, I'm not doing it either. You'll get your Vietnam War if you get me elected, but you're not going to get that thing. So that's why I think we have a military autopsy. The military controlled the autopsy. This is a military autopsy, and the military picked the least qualified people to perform it. They didn't want the body, the military or the Secret Service, going to Walter Reed because the experts from the AFIP would have done the autopsy, qualified forensic specialists. Instead, they sent it to Bethesda, where you got a couple of administrators who don't do autopsies anymore, who are not qualified to do gunshot wound autopsies, doing what they're told. And so that's my big picture of why this is so screwed up. And of course, let me finish with this thought. When you engineer 2 brain exams after the autopsy on the body, I'm not talking about 2 brain exams of the same brain. I'm talking about brain exams of 2 different brains. Kennedy's brain on Monday, November 25th, a medical school substitute brain a week later on December 2nd. You engineer 2 different brain exams. Humes and Boswell did this. They were at both events. And you suppress the photographs taken at the exam on Kennedy's brain, which were never put in the official record. And those photographs have been disowned by the photographer, John Stringer, and disowned by FBI agent Frank O'Neill. They've impugned those photos. They've said, no, that can't be his brain for various reasons. And when the brain photos in the archives are the ones taken of a substitute brain a week later, and this timeline has been proven by me. So you can watch my program called The Two Brain Exams on YouTube, or you can read chapter 10 in my book, either one. But so this proves that incompetence is not the problem with the autopsy. The old guard researchers want to only study the statements made by Humes and Boswell between 8 and 11. That's all they want to talk about. They don't even want to talk about casket entries because to them it's unseemly or too confusing. Well, I'm going to unconfuse them in my new program. I guarantee you.
Good.
And so engineering a charade with the brain and putting photos that can't be Kennedy's brain in the National Archives, that's not anything to do with incompetence. That's called a cover-up because both exams were arranged by Humes and Boswell, and they didn't invite Fink until the second event. So he was the dupe. He was the sucker. And he knew it was wrong because he put in my final thought, he put in his notes to General Bloomberg, the brain didn't look the way it looked at the autopsy on the body. It didn't look the same. But I interpret that as a fixation artifact. So he's covering his ass in case it blows up in their face. But he's not brave enough to go to the Justice Department and blow the whistle. So he knew it wasn't the same brain, or he wouldn't make entries in his notes like that and give it to his general in 1965, that the brain didn't look the same. So Frank O'Neill looked at the brain photos in the archives and he said, FBI, Frank O'Neill, he said, no, that's not the brain I saw at the autopsy. And we were astounded that he said that. He said, no, there's too much here. It's too big. He meant there was too much mass. He said more than half of the mass was missing. And he said, this looks like an intact brain, doesn't it? I looked at Jeremy, he looked at me, and Jeremy said, no, that's what we're asking you. We're asking you. And he said, no, this isn't the brain I saw. And then Stringer, said, they're on the wrong type of film. The film is on. So you know the story. So the point is, the brain photos in the archives show no damage to the right cerebellum. And I think the intention was to use them later to impugn all the Parkland testimony, to prove with photos of a substitute brain that the Parkland doctors were all wrong when they saw a big exit wound in the right rear of the head, and when so many of them saw cerebellum falling out onto the treatment cart or extruding from the wound. So that was part of that gambit, was to prove that, well, the Dallas doctors couldn't have been right because these photos show they're not right. And of course, that's the game that Dr. Michael Bodden played. That's the game he played.
9 doctors, including Kemp Clark, the head of neurosurgery at Parkland, saw the cerebellum. So, well, hey, Doug, again, appreciate your time. And we'll be off next week for a brief summer break. We may have another bonus episode in there before we get back to the second half of the series on LBJ. Thanks a lot for listening. Check out solvingjfkpodcast.com for more information. And please do check out Doug's channel. I'll put a link to his channel in the YouTube notes. And again, check out Doug's books. And if this is the first time you're hearing this, especially, or even if it's not, you're going to want to go watch these videos because it's incredibly detailed. It'll take you a little while just to get your head around the big picture. Then you're going to have questions. You'll come back, and all this stuff will be relevant. So, thanks again for listening. Thanks, Doug, for joining us, and we'll be back.
And thanks for giving us an extra 30 minutes to finish. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug.